The velocity of open source keeps speeding up, listening to the community, heavily contributing to the community is an essential part of checking what is trending as new technologies or tools becoming more relevant. Alibaba Cloud is a cloud provider who is not only contributing to the open source project like Kubernetes and etc., but also donate its own project to open source foundation like Apache and CNCF, making itself the most influential company in China when it becomes to both open source contributing and project popularity. Today, we have Jeffrey Holman, Vice President, Principal Analyst of Forrester, and Harry Zhang, CFTOC Staff Engineer of Alibaba Cloud, to talk about their perspective of the relationship between cloud provider and open source, and the impact that open source has brought to the cloud computing industry. Jeffrey, what is your perspective of impact that open source has brought to the cloud computing industry?
So I've been covering open source at Forrester since 2008. And over that time, what I have seen is that it shifted the gravity of our industry away from vendors to communities and foundations. And that's certainly true in the cloud. Foundations like the CNCF, Apache, and even Cloud Foundry have become the centers of gravity for cloud platform providers, and ISVs revolve around them. We used to talk about Microsoft developers or IBM developers, but now it's Kubernetes developers or Kafka developers. Open source has put pressure on an entire industry to adapt its pricing models from a premium price skimming model where you sold expensive perpetual licenses to a commodity price penetration model. Today, we consume our compute in gigabyte seconds as opposed to yearly licenses. It's one of the prime drivers to the reality of where we are now, and we can turn that consumption on or off as needed. But that's not to say that open source software is completely ascendant. I always warn companies that when it comes to open source, for most developers, it's not free as in freedom, but free as in beer, or more accurately, cheap as in beer. Developers will be happy to use a proprietary licensed product if the cost is low and the value is high. Those products may even be based on open source, in fact. It's the usability and the adoptability that matters. Open source is also free as in a puppy. Let me explain. It's great to have a puppy, but when you have one, you've got to take it out at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. You've got to feed it. You've got to clean up after it. It's not responsibility free. And open source can be like that. This sets up a prime opportunity for managed services. If I can have somebody else manage my open source for me, make it easier for me to run so I can focus on getting the most out of it, then there's value in that. And shops that have less time than money are perfectly happy to pay others to manage those open source services, especially if they can retain portability of assets, which is another area that open source in the cloud has had a huge impact. For example, OCI compliant containers. The end result of open source is better standards, lower costs, accelerated innovation, and yes, perhaps a bit more complexity and a little bit more messy governance of the technology we use. But I can tell you, I certainly wouldn't trade it for the older models of enterprise software.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Harry?
Right. So I think for this question, the answer is today, the cloud computing industry is already being driven or at least partially driven and accelerated by cloud-native technology today, especially for example, the Kubernetes and Docker. This is not very hard to understand because these cloud-native innovations, for example, like container and Kubernetes in past 5 years, they are essentially building an abstraction layer that makes it very easy for the users, especially for platform builders, to leverage the cloud computing capabilities. For example, virtual machines, the networking, storage. These open source technology are essentially making them very easy to use for the developers to use these technologies to build their own platforms or solve their own problems. This is really important, and because this is what the user want in many years. But This is actually only achievable today with the help of these open source technologies. This has never happened before. And when these adopters, the users found out, okay, this actually works, this indeed works, I can use this open source technology to solve my problem. They began to participate and build the community. They began to work with the open source community to make the project better, which in turn makes the open source ecosystem grow even faster and faster. And in that case, more and more cloud computing capabilities become available and accessible to those users. So in that case, you will find out, okay, since it's even more easier to be adopted by these end users, the cloud computing products began to grow faster as a result. Because for example, today, if I have Kubernetes, which means I can have an easy way to access almost every cloud computing capabilities, for example, on Alibaba Cloud. I don't even need to learn about what is the Alibaba Cloud storage, what is the VPC of Alibaba Cloud. I don't even need to know about that because Kubernetes will abstract them away by providing me with a simple container-based interface. And based on that, I can build my platform and service. I can even build my serverless application platform if I want. I can do whatever I want with minimal bar. This is actually what the cloud native open source technology have already brought us today, which really solved a lot of problems in the industry. So I will say that in the future, most of the cloud computing services or on public cloud may be built or partially built with these open source technologies, because open source, as we can see today, has essentially become the most effective connection between the users and the cloud providers. And what's more importantly is these users begin to participate or contribute to the open source ecosystem, which in turn makes ecosystem grow very fast, makes the adoption of the cloud computing technologies way easier than before. Yeah, this is what I'm currently thinking.
So what will be the latest trend in cloud native and what will be the new normal in next 5 years, Jeffrey?
You know, sometimes I joke with my clients that everything in our industry is like a sine wave. We go up and down and then up again. We see centralized systems, and then we decentralize those systems. We go to the core and then we go to the edge. Right now, it feels like we're getting more decentralized in a lot of ways. Cloud computing is embracing edge computing, whether it's edge FAS or Kubernetes at the edge or edge artificial intelligence. In 5 years, I expect we'll see a lot more workloads running at the edge of the cloud. I also think we'll see the reemergence of what we once called platform as a service, but in different ways. I think over time, we always move toward abstraction from a development perspective, as it gives us better ways of managing complexity, and it allows us to reduce the cognitive load on creatives like developers and designers. Looking ahead, I see low code, design systems, managed cloud services, serverless and FAS on containers, registries and marketplaces, all playing a big part in the cloud native future. Another area that I think will be much more clear over the next 5 years is how the build or buy model finally breaks apart. Now, over the past 40 years, organizations have been able to buy packaged applications, or they have built custom applications. And for years, all of our decisions revolved, are we going to buy SAP, or are we going to build our own supply chain management system? Are we going to build our customer-facing systems, or are we going to try to buy a package and customize it? And those decisions really occupied a tremendous amount of time as organizations tried to figure out how to run their businesses. But what we're seeing now is software as a service vendors and packaged software vendors like Salesforce, like SAP, like Manhattan Associates are embracing cloud native concepts, and they're refactoring their software into microservices that run in containers. This gives us a much more fine-grained ability to mix and match purchased services and custom bespoke software in a more granular way. It makes it easier to integrate. So in the next 5 years, I think the traditional build versus buy decision becomes buy and extend, or buy and integrate, or buy and configure. I also think that over the next 5 years, we'll still be hard at work modernizing existing applications to take advantage of cloud technologies. We're going to be better at it. We'll understand how to modernize workloads that are hard today, like data-intensive workloads that rely on ACID-compliant transactions. We'll figure out how to better modernize batch workloads and mainframe batch workloads. Hopefully, we'll have tools that make it easier to describe event taxonomies and that make it easier to build and create event-driven applications at scale. I have to tell you, I'm excited. I can't wait to see where we are in 5 years.
And Harry?
So for this question, my personal perspective is that, for example, application-centric or developer-centric. And the reason I say so is because the problem that cloud-native technology has solved today is basically, as I mentioned, building an abstraction layer for infrastructure. But we are still far away from creating real value for application owners, for example, application developers or software distributors. They're still working with a very traditional workflow, which is far away from the cloud computing. Maybe they are just, even today, they are still building their own CI/CD pipeline in their own machines. And they try to deploy applications in their own way, even though there is Kubernetes running. So we've seen that more and more efforts are already begin to move to this direction, begin to build value in the application layer and to serve the developers better instead of just solving a problem like networking and storage in Kubernetes itself. And this project has already acquired a significant adoption today. For example, we see the trend and the momentum of GitOps. We see adoption of these developer tools, which solves the real problems of the application owners instead of the infrastructure owners. Alibaba also invested in this field heavily with joint efforts of Microsoft. We built Open Application Model project. We built a Kubevilla project. So these projects all aim to bring real values like making deploying and managing applications easier and faster in today's hybrid and multi-cloud environments. Especially considering when today Kubernetes is already there, we have a common abstraction for the infrastructures. It's natural step that we want to build the application layer on top of it, which can solve the real problems of application owners instead of just solving the platform builders issues. I think this is actually true power of the cloud-native technology, and this is only achievable when we begin to shift our focus from the infrastructure layer to application layer, because we will essentially significantly lower the bar of using cloud computing, of using Kubernetes. And what's more important is the developers, the application owners, they don't really actually care about what is Kubernetes itself. What they only want to care about is their application, their code, and their business value. And I will say this is the next trend, especially in the next few years. Both the open source ecosystem as well as the cloud providers begin to think hard about how to solve these problems, how to make these application owners happy. That's why I think the application-centric or developer-centric will be the next focus for both the open source technology ecosystem as well as the cloud computing providers in the future. Right.
Okay. What is your perspective on the relationship between cloud provider and open source projects, and how will the two chains affect each other, Jeffrey?
Wow. So I think that creativity happens right at the point of dynamic tension. And that's what I see that's reflective of the relationship between cloud providers and open source communities. Projects are the intersection between these two. I think it's clear that creating win-wins for a community and cloud provider can really accelerate a project to industry-wide prominence very quickly. At the same time, if a technology doesn't have technical merit or support, then an open source license alone is not going to save it. So as more and more members join a project or community, there's a point where the network effect kicks in and a project takes off. I think cloud providers can really help projects reach that point quickly by providing managed offerings that reduce the complexity of the open source project, making it easier for organizations to consume them, or simply building awareness by making projects broadly available on top of a global infrastructure. I also think that developers, by and large, tend to respect companies that participate in and support open source communities. So support and participation create a virtuous cycle of authentic engagement. And the cloud providers that do it, I think, gain respect in the development community. Increasingly, what I see is that foundations like the CNCF or Apache end up being the plazas or the bazaars or the squares on which our developer communities form. In the past, Eric Raymond likened the traditional enterprise software vendors selling proprietary software as cathedrals. Today's cloud providers, I think, might be more akin to the subways or the highways of cities, infrastructure that lets developers and administrators get to the plazas and the cathedrals or anywhere else that we want to go. So making sure that we have the right infrastructure that lets us get to where we need to be, that lets us take advantage of the projects that matter to us and do what we need to do is critical to the success of open source. Doing that right ensures that we create common spaces that unleashes everyone's creativity. It also sets the stage to unlock a tremendous amount of value. And I think it's more than enough value for everyone to profit from.
And what about you, Harry?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question because I know for many cloud providers like AWS, we say, okay, they are doing something harmful to the open source technology ecosystem. But from my perspective, that at least if we're taking Alibaba Cloud as the example, I will say they are actually a double win situation. For example, let's say in Alibaba Cloud, Alibaba itself is actually hugely benefiting from the open source technology in terms of both internal adoption as well as how we build the external products. So today, Alibaba itself is fully running on top of cloud native stack, and we use Kubernetes, and we know how it works. And we are actually the only cloud provider today that is running itself on top of Kubernetes and containers. This is huge. And this is why we understand these projects very deep. And we can build the product based on that. That is also in turn becomes the foundation that we can build the products which can serve our customers on public cloud based. Use the same technology because we use these technologies and we know what we need to do to make our customers happy. And also that's why this product achieves significant growth because they do solve the users' problems. So this is actually a very good example to show how cloud provider today can leverage the open source project to make money, but in the meantime, become part of the ecosystem or even become the significant adopter of this open source technology. And in that case, you will really achieve double win situation. And on the other hand, because we are using these technologies, we are using these open technologies to build our own infrastructure, then that make us very easy to contribute. For example, today, Alibaba is now one of the companies who donated most open source project to CNCF. This is huge because we are not just consumers of these open source projects. We are actually the producer of the open source technologies. And we are even leading the ecosystem to think in a new angle to, for example, build application-centric layers. We're leading the open source community to work on some new fields in many cases. That's how the Alibaba, for example, the cloud provider like Alibaba Cloud can participate in the open source ecosystem in a different way instead of just say I sell the open source technology to customers. So essentially, the cloud providers like Alibaba, I know, for example, like Google, AWS, they are all already become the part of the open source ecosystem. And on the other hand, for example, these companies, engineers in these companies are also becoming significant contributors to many critical projects. For example, like Kubernetes and etcd, and we all know about the news today that Google Cloud is able to build for example, a GKE cluster for more than 10,000 nodes. This is actually only achievable with the contributions from the Alibaba Cloud engineers because we do co-work with Google to make that happen. We send patches to etcd, send improvement to Kubernetes upstream to make that happen. This is how the whole open source community or ecosystem work together, and how the cloud providers are benefiting from the involvement of these technologies, as well as pushing the technology move to the right direction. And I will say all of these contributions, all of these good results, they are all natural outcomes of when a cloud provider like Alibaba adopt the open source technology, they can actually do much, much more in the open source ecosystem. And they do have the motivation. They want to, on one hand, make their product better, and they also want to make their customers happy. And open source obviously is the best tool to achieve that with most efficient approaches. And it's also, on the other hand, save a lot of engineering effort for building their own infrastructures, because now they have the open source technologies to help their engineers to achieve the goal. So that's why I say if the cloud providers are on the right directions, they actually will achieve the double win situation regarding to the open source technology. Yeah, that is my idea.
Thank you, Jeffrey Hammond. Thank you, Harry Zhang. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.